I don't know why, but at some point, I got in the habit of always starting a class with some kind of disclaimer. Now, what it used to be was, when I'm encouraging, it sounds like I'm scolding. So just remember you're being encouraged. Anyway, so not that one tonight. Okay, tonight, one of the things that used to just set me off was when our summer series speaker would finish early. And, so I'll do just almost anything to keep from finishing early. If I run out of what I've got prepared, then my last slide, I'm going to ask some questions. And I'm going to ask for some comments, and I'm looking right at Russell Reed, and I know Russell will talk. But anyway, and if we run out, if we don't use all the time there, then David and Lonnie are going to lead some songs. So.
Good luck. You're up first,
But anyway, since we moved to Ardmore back in 2015, we've attended the Church of Christ on Merrick Drive. And it used to be the old Maxwell Church, but they built a new building out on Merrick Drive and moved out there. As a matter of fact, the first Sunday we were there was their first Sunday in the building. One of the series that they've had just recently was, I guess I would say, ramrodded by the family minister. But he asked certain people to come up and tell their story about how they were converted and about when they were converted. And, I really enjoyed that set of lessons and learned a lot. We learned this one couple, new couple, and, they didn't have any idea. Well, they were religious people. They didn't know anything about the Church of Christ until some little kid from down the hill invited them to Vacation Bible School. And that led to them being converted. But just the things that I learned out of that, I thought that might be a good topic for tonight. And so it's got one twist to it, and that's that I'm going to add some lessons to it and try to put a scriptural application on those different lessons. I wasn't raised in the church, and so my story will be a little bit different than some of you's, but it will probably be a lot like some of you's also. Like I said, I'll put some lessons up and try to give a scriptural example. But anyway, my story starts about 50 years before I start. And sometime around 1902, a man named Adolph John VonTungeln married this woman named Anna Gardner. And they settled in Calumet, Oklahoma, on a place there in the southeast part of town that was homesteaded by her mother. And he was a German Lutheran. And she was, being a Scots person, was a Scottish Presbyterian. But the only church in the town was Methodist. And so that's where they went. And, I can attest to the fact that they went there because I've got a Bible, a little, it was actually a New Testament, a little King James New Testament that was presented to my dad in 1921. And I thought that was just pretty neat. But that goes to the first lesson. And the first lesson is that things that we do today, things that you do today, can very well affect people in generations down the road. And because the fact that my grandparents were religious, and actually the fact that they attended that particular little Methodist church there in Calumet, Oklahoma, that had quite an effect on my life. And if we look at the Bible example, the one that jumped out to me the most, in Deuteronomy 17:18, the Israelites were commanded that if they ever got a king, that king was supposed to make a copy of the law, and he was supposed to keep that copy and read from it. Okay, now if we jump down to 2 Kings 22:8 and 13 also, one of the last kings of Judah is reigning. His name's Josiah. Josiah had started a great reformation trying to bring people back to God. and he was rebuilding the temple or repairing the temple, and sure enough, they found the book of the law that had been lost. Now, we don't know when that book was lost. I'm guessing, okay, I'm assuming, and I think this is, no, I'm making an educated guess here. Educated guess is that the book was lost during Solomon's reign. Now, why do I think so? Okay, because two things that the king was commanded not to do in the law. One was accumulate horses, and the other one was accumulate wives. Solomon did both of them. And so if you look at Solomon's death in 931 BC, and Josiah was born in 648 BC, 18th year of his reign would have been about 630 BC. And so if you do the arithmetic there, they were without the law, or without the real copy of the law, for about 301 years. Now you tell me that whoever it was, whichever king it was, whether it was Solomon or whether it was one of those kings of Judah that followed him, that let the law be lost, that had an effect on those people because they were without their copy of the law. Now the priests were supposed to know it, but I bet they didn't. Or I bet they didn't know it completely, because I bet the apostasy that took place would not have if they had had access to the law like they have. Okay, that's our first lesson. Side of my dad that I never saw, but he was kind of a wild child. And a story that my mom told me about him. Well, first of all, he was 9 years younger than one of his sisters. And he was 7 years younger than his other sisters. So he was kind of the baby of the family, and they thought he was spoiled and a lot of other things. But he thought that the family was overly strict. Story that my mom told, that my dad and my mom's dad were good friends. And so he was good friends with his father-in-law, or his future father-in-law. And they were talking one time, and my dad told him, he says, a lot of kids wonder if they're adopted. He says, I hope I am, because I don't belong with those people. But like I said, that's a side that I never saw of him. Now, if we fast forward about, 40 years or so, 47 years maybe, 1949, Clark Air Force, Philippine Islands. Okay, my dad was stationed there. My mom and my two sisters lived there too, and I was born there. But anyway, my dad was the public information officer. And that was a case of the Air Force doing something right, and by then it was the Air Force, not the Army Air Corps. And because my dad had been a newspaper reporter in civilian life. He had been taken off of flying status because of some injuries that he'd received during the war when he was shot down, and so he was doing that. Well, anyway, I was born. And he made the decision, my son needs to grow up on the farm. And just, I guess Monday, we were having dinner with my two sisters, and one of my sisters threw that in my face and said, yeah, I remember Dad saying my son needs to grow up on the farm. He didn't care about us. But anyway, that's just what he said. Now, he made the decision to resign from the Air Force before he bothered to tell my mom about it. And she wasn't happy. She was not happy at all because, okay, they're living in the Philippines. They're living in a big house. They've got servants, and she doesn't do much of anything. The servants take care of the kids, and they do all of that other stuff. And so anyway, she went from there to the farm in Calumet, Oklahoma. Okay, we moved to the place sometime in there, and I'm not sure exactly when, that my dad's folks traded the place in town for the place out 3 miles south of town where we lived, where I grew up. And so they moved out there. My dad had gone to the Methodist church when he was a kid, and so that's where his family went. And one of the things that I like to say about my dad was he was a spiritual leader of that family. Because while my dad was alive, we attended church services. We were there. We didn't go on Sunday nights, but we were there every Sunday morning. We were there for Sunday school. We were there for I called it church. And, he was also paying attention to make sure that I was behaving myself when I was there, also paying attention to make sure that I wasn't sleeping. And so that was a pretty big deal. But after he died in 1961, and I think I was 11, and we attended less and less faithfully until the time that I was I think when I was a senior in high school, we might have gone twice. And so it became less and less of a big deal. Okay, I didn't learn, a whole lot in the Methodist Church. I learned there was God. I learned there was Jesus, but I didn't realize that Jesus had died for my sins. But anyway, I learned that there was God. I learned that God was sovereign, and I learned that you needed to obey Him. And I can still remember what I used to pray. When I was a kid, I would pray, Lord, help me to do your will and forgive me of my sins. Now, about the 6th grade, Methodist preacher starts teaching this class. And it's for the kids that are in about the 6th grade and the 5th grade. But anyway, the class was to prepare us to join the church. And so he starts talking about baptism. So I went home and asked my mom, I said, Mom, do I need to be baptized? And she said, no, you're baptized when you're a baby. And so, that was good for then, for about the next 8 or 9 years, that was, that was good. And that brings us to our next lesson. Okay, if you honestly seek God, God's going to let you find Him. Or, you'll find Him. The example there from Scripture is the example of Cornelius. Cornelius was a godly person. Cornelius was not a Christian, but he was seeking God. So what's God do? God sends Peter to explain to Cornelius what he needs to do to be saved. Cornelius wasn't one of those people that Jesus was sent to. Jesus said that he was sent to the lost sheep of the tribe of Israel. That's what he told that Syrophoenician woman when she asked him to heal her daughter. But still, God provided a way for Cornelius to be saved. He gave a vision to Cornelius. He said, send for Simon. Peter came. Even though Cornelius was a Gentile and Peter wasn't supposed to go under his roof, he went in and spoke the gospel to him. Cornelius and his house were baptized. And so anyway, lesson 2, God is going to let us find Him if we honestly seek Him. Okay, fast forward now to 1967. Okay, 1967, I was graduating from high school. Football coach said, hey, Vaughn, you ever think about going to college? I said, yes, sir. He said, think you'd like to go to OU? I said, no, sir. He said, where do you want to go? And I said, well, I'd like to go to Stillwater. And I had made a couple of decisions. Somewhere in there, at one point I'd wanted to go to attend the Naval Academy. And at some point I decided that I didn't want to go there, that I wanted to be like a, veterinarian or something like that. And I wanted to go to Oklahoma State. Another decision that I made about that time, and this was really a dumb decision. ranks up there with the real stupid ones. But I made the decision that I wasn't going to go to college if I couldn't go on a football scholarship. So we had 7 seniors. And I think that the coach our coach had played for the coach at Northeastern State up at Tahlequah. And so, he offered all of us scholarships. But he also made some crack about agriculture majors. And that made me mad, and I said, I'm not going there. And so then I never did get an offer at Oklahoma State where I wanted to go. But I did get an offer to Panhandle A&M. And Dave and Kathleen know what I'm talking about. Kathleen lived out there. But anyway, I went out there for a visit and I said, wow, this is for me. And so that's, where I ended up going. So I sat on the bench for a couple of years. But brings us to lesson 3. Might bring us, there we go. Okay, remember Romans 8:28. And God causes all things to work together for good to those who love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. Okay, so God can bring good even from a bad decision. So he can take that stupid and stubborn decision that I made, and he can bring some good out of that. Because I went to Panhandle. And I went to Panhandle because I made a really stupid decision. Later on, different coach, but he said, hey, I talked to my coach down at East Central, and me and my buddy Fred, he was going to give Fred and me scholarships at East Central. Nah, that's okay, Coach, I'm going to Panhandle. Okay, that summer, so I was doing my last deal of farming before I went out to go to college, and the coach called me again, same coach, called me again and said, hey, did you hear that Cameron University has gone 4 years and that they're an ag school? I got you a scholarship down there. I said, no thanks, Coach, I'm going to Panhandle. But because I made that decision, that that's where I was going to go, the 2 most important things in my life happened. First thing is I was converted. And we'll get to the conversion story a little bit later. Second thing is that I met Connie. Met the love of my life, and for 50 years now. We celebrated our 50th anniversary in November. For 50 years, it's been great. Okay, now moving on. Okay, so one Saturday, the team was gone playing someplace, and I didn't make the traveling squad. And so I got up in the morning, and I said, well, since I didn't make the traveling squad, I think I'll go out and see if I can make a few dollars. So I walked, in Goodwell you could walk any place. And so I walked from the college down to the Phillips 66 station that was owned by the Strain brothers. And I said, hey, are any of the farmers around here hiring people? And one of them looked at me and he said, well, boy, did you ever shock feed? And I said, no, sir, I never did, but I'm not stupid. I bet you could teach me how. And so he said, well, come on. And so I'll explain that a little bit. What they would do, feed grains, they would tie them in bundles and just leave them out in the field. And then they'd have somebody come out there and shock them, which was pick them up, put so many of them into a stack. And I can't remember how many we were putting in a stack, but we'd put them in a stack. Then later on, they'd go out with a trailer or a truck and a pitchfork and pitchfork those things up onto the truck and put them someplace to feed cattle. And so anyway, I went out there and started doing that. About 10 o'clock in the morning, this car drives out there, and a couple other kids got out. And so the three of us were working together all day long. Now, it's just like you can imagine. You know, three guys out working, chances are the language is not going to be what it should be. The topics of conversation are not going to be what they should be. And it's, you know, it's just generally, well, I would say pretty coarse language and topics of conversation. And that wasn't any different out there. But when we left, you know, one of the guys had a car, and he gave me a ride back to the dorm. And he said, hey, you want me to pick you? You want to go to church with us tomorrow morning? I said, well, yeah, sure. And not only, his name was Larry Wood. And not only did Larry invite me to church, he picked me up the next morning to go. And that brings us to the next lesson. Okay, just because you've said something or done something that you think would kill your influence, or said something or done something that you think people wouldn't pay any attention to you, that's not right. Because even though Larry had been out there telling, using off-color language and telling off-color jokes, when he asked me to go to church with him, I said yes. And I think of the example of the Apostle Paul, and I believe that's what we've got there in Galatians. In Galatians 1:13, Paul talks about the fact that he was a persecutor of the church. But then he also talks about, in 21 through 24, Galatians 1:21 through 24, how when he went to the churches in Syria and Cilicia, that they were glad to see him and that they rejoiced because the one who had been persecuting the church was now teaching and preaching and was now a Christian. And so it doesn't make any difference what you think you might have done. Share Jesus anyway. Went to church of Christ in Goodwell, Oklahoma. David and Kathleen know who the preacher was. The preacher's name was Roger Todd. And I was impressed with Roger from the get-go. And the reason I was impressed with him was because he was preaching out of the Bible. And he wasn't just preaching out of the Bible, he pretty well knew it too. Another thing that I noticed was there wasn't an organ. And I said, well, my sister wouldn't have fit in here because she wouldn't have an organ to play. But anyway, but then the other thing that I noticed, there was this tall, attractive young woman that was sitting in the back with a bunch of kids. And when they broke up for Bible class, she led those kids back, and of course that was Connie. And I happened to notice her right then. We went to Larry and some of the other kids there invited me to go on a youth retreat with them at Portales, New Mexico. And so anyway, we went out there. And one of the things that I noticed there, we're sitting in this big auditorium singing. And I can remember all of us kids at the Methodist church, they would just about have to beat a song out of us. But here are my buddies that are sitting next to me, and they're singing. And they're not singing because somebody's threatening them. They're singing because they want to praise God. And singing and actually enjoying it. And I was thinking, wow. I said, these guys are praising God. Wow, isn't that neat? And one of the guys there was a guy named Gene McCarty. Now, if you looked in the dictionary and looked up preacher boy, there'd be a picture of Gene next to it. Okay, Gene had these big, thick glasses, and he had brown, wavy hair. and he was tall and skinny. And, but anyway, so Gene and I, that's not all about Gene though. Okay, that's one side of him. The other side of him was that he rode a Honda 50 to Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan to do mission work. Well, he said it was to do mission work, but he had a girlfriend up there too. But anyway, okay, Gene was just a fantastic mechanic. And one time Gene and Larry and I had gone to a gospel meeting over at Boise City. And we're coming back, and Gene had this 55 Ford. And he was talking about how good his Ford ran. And Larry said, well, Doc, I bet you couldn't get that car up to 90. So at 120, Larry's begging him to slow down, you know. And I'm scared to death. But anyway, so that was Gene. Gene asked me if I wanted to study the Bible with him. I said, sure. And so we're studying along, and he asked me, he said, well, do you need to be baptized? I said, well, no, I don't need to be baptized. I was baptized when I was a kid, because that's what my mom told me back, about 8 years before. Gene read Acts 2:38. And he said, back there when you were a kid and you were baptized, exactly what sins did you repent of? Hey, I didn't know. I said, I didn't have any sins back then, I don't think. And he said, exactly. And so anyway, he read that. He read Acts 8, 36 through 38. And I believe this is part of the account of the eunuch. Does somebody have that? Can somebody turn to Acts 8, 36 through 38 and read it real loud? Okay, so now we got the race going on between the paper Bible and the phone. Go ahead, Jeff.
As they traveled along the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, look, here's water. What can stand in the way of me being baptized? And he gave orders to stop the chariot. Then both Philip and the eunuch went down into the water, and Philip baptized him. When they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord suddenly took Philip away, and the eunuch did not see him again, but he went on his way rejoicing. And I think that's all.
I think you got it. You got the part that I wanted anyway. Okay, the other thing was that when the eunuch wanted to go down into the water and be baptized, Philip asked him if he believed that Jesus was the Son of God. Those were two things that I was pretty sure I hadn't done. And so I said, okay, I think you're right, Gene. I'll be baptized on Sunday next time we meet. He said, no. He said, why don't we do it tonight? And so he got on the phone and called Roger Todd. And the baptistry there in the Goodwill Church wasn't working. And so Roger called the preacher in Guyman. And so we went over to Guyman. Now this is January. This is January, I think maybe 1969. And it was cold. And well, if you've ever been to Guyman in January, you know it's cold out there. But anyway, it was cold. And so Gene went down and baptized me there in the baptistry at the Guyman Church. And and that's pretty much the story. But it brings us to lesson 5 now. Okay, lesson 5 is that God does things His way, and He does things on His own timetable. The example that I've got up here right now, well, two examples. Genesis 16:16. Abram was 86 years old when Sarah decided that she'd take matters into her own hands and give Abram her servant girl to have a child with. In Genesis 17, when God promised Abram that his descendants would have all that land where they were, Abram was 99 years old. Second Kings 5:11. That's the story, one of my favorite Bible stories. That's the story of Naaman. Now, you know, whatever you might think about Naaman, Naaman must have been a pretty good guy. And here's why I think that. First of all, he had the little slave girl in his house, one of those captives from Judah, and that little girl told Naaman's wife, she said, you know, I wish my master was with the prophet in Judah, because that prophet could heal him. Naaman was a leper. And if that's not enough, the other thing is, Naaman goes to the king, and he's taken to the king of Judah. He's taken a letter from the king of Assyria, and the king of Assyria says, here's my servant Naaman, heal him. And the king of Judah said, see what he said, you know. And so Elisha found out about this, and Elisha said, send him out to me. So they go out to Elisha's place, and Elisha doesn't even come out and meet him. Elisha sends his servant out and says, yeah, go dip 7 times in the Jordan River, you'll be healed, or you'll be cleansed. That's not good enough for Naaman. Naaman was, you know, put it mildly, Naaman was mad. And he said, I thought that the prophet had come out and do something and da-da-da, you know. And this is the other reason why I think Naaman was a pretty good guy. Because some of Naaman's servants said to him, they talked sense to him. They said, well, you know, if the prophet had asked you to do some great thing, wouldn't you have done it? He's asking you to go bathe in the river. Why don't you do that? Okay? And Naaman didn't just listen to him. He did what they told him. And so Naaman was healed because of that. Okay, now moving on. This is not part of the conversion story, but this is a good part that I thought I needed to put in there anyway. And so I started studying on my own and had this kid from Goodwill that was a couple of years behind me in school, and we were sitting in a physics lab together. And he said, you know, you ought to go to a Christian college. And I said, why is that? And he said, because you could find you a good Christian wife there. I said, well, I could find a Christian wife here. And he said, name one. Okay, first name that popped into my mind, and we were not dating or anything like that. First name that popped into my mind was Connie Whitehead. And so that's what I said. I told him that, and that shut him up for a while. And so about, I don't know, this is probably 6 months later, you know, going to a youth retreat again, Portales, New Mexico again. And, you know, I asked Connie to go to the student union with me to get a Coke, and the rest is history. Okay, so anyway, that's my story. Okay, so now who else wants to share a story? I'll give you the microphone. And, you know, I don't really want to hear David and Lonnie leading singing. So, if we don't have a volunteer pretty quick, you know, I'll start calling some names, and I know enough people that I can call names. So, who would like to be the first one? Who wants to be the first one to share a story, a conversion story? Go ahead, Darlene.